Hi there, I'm glad you're back. In our last video, I had discussed aortic arches, kind of the basic pattern, and I had discussed how the gas bladder is connected to blood vessels. So let's talk about changes that occur in the circulatory system when vertebrates have evolved this ability to breathe. If you recall from our section on the heart, there's this single circuit where blood goes from the heart out to the gills and back around, very simple. And then when lungs are involved, there's a double circuit where blood vessels have to leave the heart and go to the lungs and back. And then the heart also pumps a second time out and around to the body and back. If you think about it, when it comes to breathing oxygen, that kind of second circuit is necessary. Well, here's the thing. It would be great if lungs had just developed straight from gills and we could just retain that single circuit mechanism, but they didn't. Lungs developed, or at least the best hypothesis is they came from gas bladders. So that is why I discussed gas bladder, how gas bladders are connected to the blood vessels. With evolution, you kind of have to take what's existing and then modify it. You can't just make it up because it'd be easier. Sometimes the organism has to work with what it's got. And what it had is a set of blood vessels going to and from the gas bladder and then back to the heart. It also tended to have blood vessels that left kind of close to that sixth aortic arch to the gas bladder and then came back to the heart. And so what has to happen for an organism to get the most efficient oxygen out of what they're breathing when they're using lungs instead of gills is that oxygen, poorly oxygenated blood needs to be directed to the lungs. Somehow, if it's not getting oxygen from the gills, you have to bypass the gills and get over to the lungs so you can get oxygen. Another thing that has to happen is once the oxygen-rich blood comes back to the heart, well, certainly the heart has to keep the oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor blood from mixing, but we've already discussed that in class. The blood vessel aspect of that is that assuming the blood comes out of the heart fairly rich in oxygen and didn't mix too much, it has to get away from the gills because there's no purpose of sending it through gills if they're not working anyway because they're not breathing water. And then it's just taking time that your tissues aren't getting oxygen. So those things have to happen. Well, here's how it works. Adaptations that have happened in the lungfish are that the pulmonary artery develops from that sixth arch. As I mentioned before, the pulmonary artery going to the gas bladder is really close to that sixth arch. So it's not a big stretch to say, okay, here's the sixth arch, it's leaving the heart, it's going through gills right here, and it's wrapping around and it's going to go to the lung. You can see it from this angle. Here's this one, it's facing the other direction, but over here you've got blood that's poor in oxygen going through the sixth arch, and then it can, before it goes through the dorsal aorta and around, it can wrap over here to this pulmonary artery to the lung, and then it can return from the lung rich in oxygen. When it does that, there's this little piece of artery that used to just go straight up from the sixth branch, but now it can be bypassed, and it's just labeled ductus here. It's called the ductus arteriosus. It's this little piece of blood vessel that's between these branchial arches of the gills and over here where it kind of splits, either go to lungs or it can split over here and go through the dorsal aorta. What's interesting about this, I think, is when people ask you, oh, is evolution really real? You can just simply tell them that, hey, in my convert class, I found out that, all of our pulmonary arteries came from our sixth arch. And that was actually an arch for gills in fish, and yet it's found in all of us. And so that shows that we came from fish. That's something kind of interesting you can pass on to someone who's sort of doubting. Now, the other thing I mentioned has to happen is if you've got oxygen-rich blood here, you don't want to spend a lot of time pumping it through gills when it's not necessary. If you've got oxygen-rich blood, you need to get it out to the body. You can't pump backwards, but what it can do and what happens is that a couple of those arches, namely arch 3 and 4, do you notice in this illustration there's no gill attached to them? And so there's no kind of capillary bed or anything else. It's just a continuous blood vessel now between the ventral aorta and the dorsal aorta, and that really makes for an aortic arch. Hint, hint. Guess where that's going to come from later. It's over here how it comes in and kind of snakes around, and that lets oxygen-rich blood bypass the gills and go right out to the body to feed it. Lungfish are really cool because they can actually breathe water or they can breathe air, so they can switch back and forth, and they need to have a mechanism in order to switch. And what they do is they have these little valves, and the valves can kind of open and close blood vessels. When a lungfish is breathing water, what they'll do is they'll close these valves in, if they're breathing water, they're closing valves in these 3rd and 4th arch because you don't want blood that's poor in oxygen to come through over here. Otherwise, you're going to have poorly oxygenated blood mixing with richly oxygenated blood, and that's just not good for the whole system. Over here, it also closes off. Right here, it'll close off this pulmonary artery because if you've got blood that's rich in oxygen from the gill, you don't need to send it to the lung. I want to point out what's something really interesting here is that when it is breathing water, the heart is entirely blue. Basically, the fish is using single circuit mode instead of double circuit. So over here, you've got all this poorly oxygenated blood. It can't go right back around, which is good, but it is shuffled off into the 2nd, 5th, and 6th arches. And those are arches that still have gills. So 2nd, 2, 5, and 6 still have gills, and therefore, when they're using respiration in water, of course, you want to send the blood to the gills and not elsewhere. Makes sense. When lungfish are trying to respire on land, they have to switch over to this double circuit mode. So what happens here is they've got some of the blood coming back to their heart that's poor in oxygen, and they need to separate that out, and the adaptations of the heart do that, and again, I'm not getting into those. But there are valves here that are going to close off the 2nd and the 5th branch, 2nd and the 5th aortic arch, and then there's a valve here in the ductus arteriosus that closes that off. And so anything over here, it can't go through the gills here and here, which aren't going to work anyway in the air. And instead, the poorly oxygenated blood is going to be pushed up here into the 6th arch, and then that's going to wrap around and go to the lung where oxygen can be obtained. When oxygen is obtained, you come down here to the left side of the heart, and then when it goes out, and things like the spiral valve and so forth in the heart push it in the right direction, it's going to get wrapped around into these 3rd and 4th arches. And you notice that the valves on those are now open. So now this oxygenated blood can go through here, bypass the gills, and move on its way to supplying the body with oxygen. That's kind of a partial transition. It's a transition definitely away from teleos, but now there's a much bigger transition that happens when you go from even lungfish to tetrapods, because now they're permanently breathing air. So there's a number of things that just aren't necessary at all. I want to go back to those questions we posed earlier. And those questions were, which arches were lost and which arches are retained and why? And how are any remaining arches repurposed through evolution? What do branchial arteries in gills become when fish transition to tetrapods? I've actually broken this into 3 slides on amphibians, so bear with me on this. I'll do a couple of arches at a time. First of all, what's lost? Look at the dotted lines. The first, the second, and the fifth are lost. So you've got 1, 2 is lost, then 3 is there, 4 is there, 5 is lost, and 6 is still here. First, of course, was lost already. It was lost in the teleost. But now you've got second and fifth lost also. I want you to think back to what they did. Again, to explain why. I also want to point out that not all amphibians have that pattern in the nectarist. They continue them. They actually use they use 3 and 5 for 3 through 5 to connect up to external gills. So they're all a little different. The ductus arteriosus, that was that kind of pathway that if it was respiring through water, then blood can go through the gills and come back out. That little passageway is lost in the tetrapods. You notice, is it really necessary on land? Things to think about. And what I'll point out here is this last arch, this pulmonary. Since this ductus arteriosus is gone, they can only go to pulmonaries now. It doesn't have anywhere else. So this becomes a dedicated pulmonary artery with a dedicated pulmonary arch. Something kind of fun, what about tadpoles? How do they use their gills? Well, tadpoles actually retain their 5th and 6th arches, but then later lose them in metamorphosis. When they kind of get closer to crawling out of the water, they start gulping air. So they're kind of getting to that point where they're losing gills and needing lungs. Just curiosity. Okay, another thing that happens in amphibians, between kind of fish and amphibians, is that over here, this 3rd arch, it used to wrap around and then join the 4th. Remember 3rd and 4th and lungfish went together? Over here, right here, it's called the ductus caroticus, and it's lost. Instead, what happens is this 3rd branch, instead of turning directions and going caudal, it remains going cranial. And it becomes the internal carotid to supply the brain. Over here, in between the 3rd and 4th arches, it used to just be ventral aorta, but now it's split, and you have common carotids here. And as they project forward, they become external carotids. Now, in things like mammals, what we have is our common carotids are much longer. They're just showing it here in terms of like what you maybe have in a small organism, or like a frog doesn't have much of a neck anyway. But these are not necessarily reflective of the length and everything, because the length is really dramatic. Think about a giraffe. So just want to point that out. If you're curious about your carotids, feel alongside your trachea and see if you can feel your blood pulsing in those carotid arteries while we're talking about this. The 4th aortic arch, that's another one that's retained, but I'll explain kind of what it becomes. Remember I mentioned the ductus caroticus disappears. That's that connection between 3rd and 4th. So now 4 is sort of standalone from 3. And so what happens is the 4th arch becomes a double arched aorta. So it has an arch on each side that becomes left and right systemic arteries. And they're coming from a truncus arteriosus. There's a single one coming from a single ventricle. It's coming up, and it comes up and then it splits. And in your frog pictures and so forth, and in your real frogs, these three vessels are right next to each other. There's no space in between them. They're like tightly packed. But as soon as it goes up the truncus arteriosus, then these three are packed on each side, it splits, and then one piece of that kind of bundled group goes off to become pulmonaries, another becomes systemic arteries, wraps around, and then joins the dorsal aorta under the heart. And then the last group splits off to become carotids and goes forward. Just as a little connection for lab, here's the heart up here. You can't really see truncus or anything, but down here you can see the systemic arches. They come in on both sides, and they're, again, very symmetrical. And then they converge together into the dorsal aorta. We will talk about more in the next video.